The air in the alley behind the Gilded Spoon was thick with the competing smells of yesterday's garbage and the expensive perfume of the restaurant's clientele. Hannah Scott leaned against the cool brick wall, the phone pressed so hard against her ear it hurt. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the device, a flimsy shield against the words tumbling through the line. "I can't, Trish, I just can't." Her voice was a raw whisper, a stark contrast to the professional, cheerful tone she was paid to maintain. "He's going to be there, with her. I'll look like the world's biggest failure." A wave of humiliation washed over her, so potent it felt like a physical chill. She could already picture it. Alexander, her ex, looking effortlessly handsome in a tailored suit, and Gloria, his model-esque fiancée, who also happened to be Patricia's cousin, draped on his arm. And then there would be Hannah, alone, the discarded girlfriend, still a waitress, still single. The thought was a lead weight in her stomach. She ended the call with a shaky breath, squeezing her eyes shut for a single, precious second. The professional mask had to go back on. She pushed off the wall, straightened the crisp white apron over her black uniform, and forced a smile that felt brittle, like a pane of glass about to shatter. Back in the hushed elegance of the main dining room, she moved with a practiced grace, her steps silent on the plush carpet. Her gaze swept the room until it landed on her final table of the night, tucked away in a discreet corner. Theodore. He was her regular mystery. He came in at least twice a week, always alone, always dressed in clothes that were too casual for a place like this. A simple gray sweater, worn-in jeans, yet he never seemed out of place. He possessed a quiet confidence that was its own form of authority. More than that, he was kind. In a world where men with money often looked right through her, Theodore looked at her. His eyes, a startling shade of deep blue, held a genuine warmth that always caught her off guard. She had, in her mind, decided he must be like her, someone on the outside looking in, perhaps saving up for a special meal. Rich people weren't this gentle. "Rough day, Hannah?" he asked as she approached. His voice was low and smooth, a calm current in her turbulent sea of anxiety. He had noticed. Of course he had. He always seemed to notice the slight tremor in her hands, or the exhaustion hiding behind her smile. The question, so simple and sincere, was the tiny crack that broke the dam. The words spilled out of her in a hushed, desperate torrent. The wedding, the ex, the beautiful fiancé, the crushing weight of her own perceived failure. She told him everything, her voice barely audible over the distant clink of silverware, her professional composure completely deserting her. He listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. There was no pity in his eyes, only a focused, thoughtful attention. The space between them felt charged, a small bubble of shared confidence in the crowded room. When she finally fell silent, her cheeks flushed with the shame of her oversharing, she expected him to offer a few polite, meaningless words of comfort. Instead, a wild, reckless idea sparked in the chaos of her mind. It was insane. It was unprofessional. It was, quite possibly, the only thing that could save her. It was born of his kindness, of the easy way he spoke to her, of the mistaken belief that he was just a regular guy who might understand. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Theo," she began, the name a soft, hesitant breath. "I know this is completely insane. You don't know me, not really, but..." She took a shaky breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. Could you go with me, to the wedding?" She rushed the next words out before she could lose her nerve. "As my husband." The silence that followed was deafening. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. She felt a hot flush of regret creep up her neck. He was going to laugh, or worse, look at her with the pity she dreaded. She had crossed a line. She had ruined the one simple, pleasant interaction in her otherwise complicated life. But he didn't laugh. After a long, agonizing moment, the corner of his mouth twitched. A slow, deliberate smile spread across his face, a smile that held a depth of amusement she couldn't begin to fathom. It reached his eyes, making them sparkle with a sudden dangerous light. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze still locked on hers. "Your husband?" he repeated, the words rolling off his tongue, laced with an intriguing, almost predatory humor. He considered her, his head tilted slightly. "Hannah Scott," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. "That is, without a doubt, the most interesting proposal I've received all year." He leaned forward again, the space between them crackling with an unspoken electricity. "I accept." The day of the wedding arrived like a rapidly approaching storm front, a mix of dread and a strange, thrilling anticipation. Hannah stood in her small apartment, the scent of lavender and chamomile tea, her personal ritual for calming her nerves, hanging faintly in the air. She smoothed down the fabric of her simple but elegant navy blue dress for the 10th time, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was a terrible, brilliant idea. A sharp, confident knock echoed from her front door. Her breath hitched. He was here. When she opened the door, the man standing in her hallway made the air leave her lungs in a silent rush. This was not Theo, her kind, casually dressed diner friend. This was a different man entirely. He was encased in a dark, exquisitely tailored suit that seemed to have been spun from midnight and money. It fit his broad shoulders perfectly, hinting at the power in his frame. His hair was styled, his shoes gleamed with a light of their own, and on his wrist, a watch with a dark, complex face caught the dim hallway light, winking at her like a tiny, expensive star. "Wow," she breathed, her eyes wide. You really clean up." A slow smile touched his lips, the same one from the restaurant, but now it was framed by a jawline that looked sharp enough to cut glass. "The role of husband has a certain dress code," he said, his voice a low, smooth rumble. He offered her his arm, and the fabric of his suit was impossibly fine beneath her fingers. "Shall we, Mrs. Scott?" The playful title sent a ridiculous, inappropriate shiver down her spine. She took his arm, feeling like she was stepping into a different world. At the wedding, Theodore was a revelation. He wasn't just playing a part. He was inhabiting it. His hand rested possessively on the small of her back, a constant, warm pressure that was both a comfort and a source of dizzying electricity. He navigated the sea of high society guests with an effortless grace, introducing himself as Hannah's husband, with a charming smile that left everyone, including Hannah, slightly breathless. He would lean in to whisper a witty, cutting observation about a particularly pompous guest, his breath warm against her ear, making her laugh a real, genuine laugh. He kept her wine glass full, anticipated her needs, and every so often, he would look down at her. That look. It was a masterpiece of performance, a gaze so full of adoration, so intense, it felt like he was seeing into her very soul. A treacherous, foolish part of her wished it were real. The effect on her ex was immediate and deeply satisfying. Alexander's handsome face was a mask of confusion and irritation. He kept shooting glances at them from across the room, his eyes narrowed on Theodore, a silent predator, sizing up a rival. For the first time since their breakup, Hannah felt powerful. She wasn't the girl he left behind. She was the woman who had moved on to someone far more compelling. The illusion was perfect. Too perfect. Later in the evening, as they stood near the towering, flower-draped wedding cake, a portly, smiling man with a kind face approached them. Hannah recognized him as Mr. Gable, Patricia's father. "What a wonderful celebration, isn't it?" Mr. Gable boomed, shaking Theodore's hand with enthusiasm. He then paused, his brow furrowing as he looked more closely at Theodore. "You look incredibly familiar. Have we met?" "I don't believe so," Theodore replied smoothly, his smile never faltering. "But Mr. Gable's eyes suddenly lit up with recognition. "Wait a moment. Vandenberg, you're Theodore Vandenberg. My goodness, what an honor to have you here. I didn't know you were a friend of the family. Hannah froze. The name hit her like a physical blow, an icy shock that stole the air from her lungs. Vandenberg. It wasn't a common name. It was the name emblazoned in elegant gold script above the entrance of the Gilded Spoon. It was the name on her paycheck. It was the name of the vast international restaurant empire she worked for. The room around her seemed to tilt, the cheerful music fading to a dull roar in her ears. She slowly, mechanically, turned her head to face the man beside her. The man whose arm was still wrapped around her waist. The man she had begged to pretend to be her husband because she thought he was a kind, poor soul, just like her. Vandenberg? She whispered, the name a foreign, choking sound on her tongue. He met her wide, horrified gaze. The charming smile he gave her was still there, but now it looked different. It looked guilty. "Ah," he said, his voice a soft, apologetic murmur meant only for her. "I suppose I may have omitted a few minor details about my day job." In that single, heart-stopping moment, the entire charade shattered. Her pretend husband wasn't just rich. He wasn't just a guest. He was Theodore Vandenberg, her boss. The following morning, shame was a physical entity. It was the bitter taste in Hannah's coffee, the heavy weight on her shoulders, the hot flush that crept up her neck every time she replayed the scene in her mind. Vandenberg. She had asked the billionaire owner of a global restaurant empire to pose as her husband to spite her ex-boyfriend. The sheer, mortifying absurdity of it made her want to crawl into a hole and never come out. Her first instinct was to draft a resignation email. It was the only logical course of action. Just as she was mentally composing the first sentence, her doorbell rang. The sound was so sharp and unexpected it made her jump. She wasn't expecting anyone. She peered through the peephole, and her heart promptly dropped to her stomach. It was him, Theodore Vandenberg, standing on her worn-out welcome mat, looking as out of place as a panther in a petting zoo. He was back in his casual clothes, a soft dark Henley and jeans, but the illusion was shattered. She could now see the quiet, undeniable luxury in the perfect cut of the fabric, the fine leather of his boots. In his hands, he held a cardboard tray with 2 large coffees. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the door. "We need to talk about the terms of our marriage," he said, his lips twitching with that same infuriatingly charming smile. There was no hint of anger or awkwardness in his eyes, only a deep, unnerving amusement. She stepped back, letting him into her tiny apartment. He moved into the space with an easy confidence, his presence seeming to shrink the room. He placed the coffees on her small kitchen counter, his gaze sweeping over her collection of mismatched mugs and well-loved paperbacks. "You're my boss," she blurted out, the words a mixture of accusation and pure horror. "The owner of everything. And you let me drag you into that ridiculous, embarrassing charade." He turned to face her, leaning back against the counter. "To be fair," he said, his voice laced with laughter, "it was the most entertaining evening I've had in years." Alexander's face was a masterpiece of bewildered fury. The fact that he found it funny only deepened her mortification. He then explained his own situation, the story tumbling out with a surprising frankness. He spoke of his mother, a formidable matriarch with an iron will and a singular obsession, seeing him married to a woman of appropriate standing. Every holiday, every family gathering was a parade of bland, beautiful heiresses, all with impeccable bloodlines and personalities as dull as dishwater. "They're not people, they're portfolios," he said, a flicker of genuine weariness crossing his face. "My mother's favorite pastime is matchmaking. It's exhausting." He paused, his blue eyes locking onto hers. The playful amusement was back, but now it was sharpened with purpose. He pushed off the counter and took a step closer. The air between them grew thick, charged. "So," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial low, "I have a counter-proposal." He leaned forward, the scent of his cologne. a subtle, clean scent of sandalwood and something else she couldn't name, reaching her. You needed a husband for one night. As it happens, I need a wife for one weekend. My parents' anniversary party is in 2 weeks, in the Hamptons. Hannah's mind went blank. The Hamptons. Come with me, he continued, his eyes gleaming with a reckless, exciting light. Pretend to be my wife. My mother's reaction upon meeting a waitress as her new daughter-in-law will be a memory I will cherish for the rest of my life. It would be an act of glorious rebellion. That's insane, she stammered, her heart beginning to pound for an entirely different reason. It's a game, he corrected softly. An adventure. He took another step, closing the remaining distance between them. And, in exchange for your performance, I'll deposit a bonus into your account that would solve your financial concerns for the next year. He was so close now, she could see the flecks of gold in his deep blue eyes. He was offering her a way out of the crushing debt that kept her awake at night, a chance to finally breathe. But the price was to step even deeper into this dangerous, intoxicating fantasy. He lowered his voice to a near whisper, the sound sending a shiver across her skin. What do you say, wife? Hannah's acceptance was less a word and more a shaky, disbelieving nod. The sum he had mentioned was life-changing. It was freedom. It was the end of the gnawing anxiety that was her constant companion. For that, she would walk into the lion's den. She would face 1,000 of his mothers. Good, Theodore said, his smile widening. He took a step back, the intense energy between them receding to a more manageable hum. But if we're going to do this, we have to be convincing. My mother has a nose for deception. We need a history. We need memories. And so, the construction began. It was a dizzying, surreal immersion into his world. The following evening he picked her up not in a taxi, but in a sleek black car with a private driver. He took her to a tiny Michelin-starred restaurant hidden on a cobblestone street she never knew existed. Every couple needs a spot, he explained, his eyes twinkling over the rim of his wine glass. This can be ours. The food was art, the wine was liquid velvet, and the conversation was surprisingly easy. He made her laugh, a deep, genuine sound that felt rusty from disuse. The weekend after, he flew her to Paris. It's a business trip for me, he said, as if flying someone to Paris on a whim was the most normal thing in the world. But we need travel photos. Couples have photos. They walked along the Seine, his arm casually draped around her shoulders for a selfie. They stood before the Eiffel Tower as it glittered against the night sky. And for the picture, he pulled her close, his hand resting on her waist. The pose was for the camera, but the warmth of his body seeping through her coat was undeniably real. She felt a strange, dizzying sense of belonging that both thrilled and terrified her. The most dangerous part of building their lie, however, happened in the quiet, ordinary moments. To make their story seamless, he began spending his evenings at her apartment. We need to know the little things, he reasoned, settling onto her lumpy but comfortable sofa. Your favorite movie, the story behind that ugly mug, my coffee order. They would watch old black and white films, sharing a bowl of popcorn. He would tell her about the pressures of his empire, the crushing loneliness that came with a name that was more of a brand than a family. The fortress of Theodore Vandenberg would crumble, and in its place she would see just Theo, a man with his own burdens and a surprising vulnerability. In turn, she found herself telling him things she had never told anyone. She spoke of her dream to one day open a small cafe and bookstore, a cozy place that smelled of coffee and old paper. She confessed her deep-seated fear of ending up like her mother, trapped by circumstance and regret. One rainy Tuesday night, the line between performance and reality blurred into non-existence. They were sitting on her floor, surrounded by Chinese takeout containers, the soft lamplight creating an intimate glow. The movie had ended an hour ago, but neither of them had moved. The conversation had drifted into that quiet, late-night territory where truths are whispered. No one ever just sees me, he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual confidence. He stared down at the beer bottle held loosely between his hands. They see the name, the money, the opportunity. It's like being behind a wall of glass. "I know what you mean," she whispered, her heart aching for him. "Sometimes at the restaurant, I feel invisible. I'm just a pair of hands that brings the food." He looked up, his gaze intense. "I never saw you that way, Hannah. Not even once." The air grew thick, heavy. The sound of the rain against her window pane was the only noise in the room. They weren't acting anymore. They weren't boss and employee. They were just a man and a woman, sharing a moment of profound, startling connection. The space between them was no longer just a few feet of worn rug. It was a chasm of unspoken feelings, of terrifying possibilities. He eventually pushed himself to his feet, the spell breaking. "It's late. I should go." He walked to the door, his posture suddenly stiff. He paused with his hand on the knob, his back to her. The silence stretched, filled with everything they couldn't say. She felt an overwhelming urge to tell him to stay. "Theo," she whispered, her voice barely a tremor. He turned his head slightly, his profile silhouetted against the hallway light. The attraction between them was a physical force, a magnetic pull that was almost painful. She could see the conflict in the tense line of his jaw. "Good night, Hannah," he said, his voice soft but final. And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet of her apartment. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm. This wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't a joke. This was becoming dangerously, terrifyingly real. The drive to the Hamptons was a masterclass in charged silence. They sat in the plush leather back seat of Theodore's car, the quiet hum of the engine a stark contrast to the storm of unspoken thoughts raging between them. The easy camaraderie of their practice sessions had evaporated, replaced by a nervous, electric tension. The memory of their last night, of that raw moment of connection, hung in the air, a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. The Vandenberg estate was not a house. It was a declaration of power. A sprawling, white-columned mansion rose from acres of perfectly manicured lawn, looking less like a home and more like a private museum. Hannah's small apartment could fit into the foyer. As they stepped out of the car, Theodore's hand found hers. His grip was firm, reassuring. "Ready?" he murmured, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. The small gesture sent a jolt of warmth through her. "No," she whispered honestly, and he gave her a faint, understanding smile. The front door swung open before they reached it, revealing a woman who could only be Eleanor Vandenberg. She was tall and slender, dressed in a cream-colored cashmere dress that probably cost more than Hannah's monthly rent. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her face was a mask of cool, aristocratic beauty. "Theodore, you're late," she said, her voice as crisp and cold as a winter morning. Her eyes, the same deep blue as her son's, but lacking any of their warmth, swept over Hannah in a swift, dismissive appraisal. "And you've brought a guest." "Mother," Theodore said, his tone smooth as silk as he pulled Hannah forward. "This is Hannah, my wife." If Eleanor was shocked, she hid it behind a lifetime of practiced composure. Only a slight, almost imperceptible tightening of her lips betrayed her surprise. She extended a cool, dry hand to Hannah. "So," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes, "you are my son's surprise." The weekend was a gauntlet of subtle psychological warfare. Eleanor was a master of the veiled insult, the backhanded compliment. "That's a lovely dress, dear," she remarked at dinner, her gaze flicking over Hannah's carefully chosen but off-the-rack outfit. It's always so refreshing to see someone who isn't a slave to designer labels. She peppered Hannah with questions, each one a tiny, elegant trap. "Where did you go to university? Who is your family? What do your parents do for a living?" But Theodore was a brilliant, unwavering shield. He was always there, deflecting his mother's barbs with a sharp, lazy wit, and a protective affection that felt anything but fake. He would place a hand on her knee under the table, or laugh and say, "Mother, stop interrogating my wife. You'll scare her off." Every gesture, every word, wove their fabricated story into something stronger, more believable. The breaking point came during the main dinner on the second night, in a dining room that glittered with crystal and old money. Eleanor, having failed to trip Hannah up, went for a more direct attack. "So tell me, Hannah," she said, her voice carrying across the long, polished table, "how exactly did a woman like you meet a man like my son?" The implication was clear. How did you sink your claws into him? The table fell silent. All eyes turned to them. Hannah's heart began to hammer against her ribs. This was it. The lie would unravel. But Theodore simply smiled, a slow, dazzling smile. He reached for Hannah's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "It's a wonderful story, actually," he began, his voice low and captivating. He told the assembled guests that he had been caught in a sudden downpour and had ducked into the first place he saw, a tiny, dusty, second-hand bookstore. And there she was, sitting in a worn armchair, completely lost in a book, her face illuminated by a single shaft of afternoon light. He described, in vivid romantic detail, how he had watched her for a full 10 minutes, utterly captivated, before pretending to be interested in a book near her just so he could speak to her. He even remembered the title of the book she was supposedly reading. The story was so beautiful, so detailed, so perfectly romantic that it silenced the entire table. It silenced Hannah. She stared at him, her heart aching with the beauty of the lie. It was the most wonderful thing anyone had ever said about her, and none of it was true. Later that night, they stood in the vast, impersonal guest suite they were sharing. The tension between them was a living thing, a third presence in the room. "That story," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Downstairs. It was beautiful." He turned from the window where he had been staring out at the dark, manicured gardens. His face was serious, his eyes intense in the dim light. "I didn't invent all of it," he said, his voice low and rough. He took a step toward her. "The part about being completely captivated by an incredible woman in the most unexpected of places." He paused, his gaze holding hers. That part was true. Theodore's confession hung in the air, as potent and intoxicating as the expensive wine they'd had at dinner. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. The vast, silent bedroom, with its king-sized bed and antique furniture, suddenly felt impossibly small, charged with a dangerous, crackling energy. They were supposed to be actors in a play, but he had just ripped up the script. The proximity forced upon them by the charade was becoming a sweet, exquisite form of torture. They had to maintain the illusion of a married couple, which meant sharing this suite. A heavy oak door connected his bedroom to hers, a door they both were intensely aware of. It was a flimsy barrier against the truth that was growing between them. Every night, she would lie in her bed, staring at that door, her heart pounding, half terrified, half hoping he might open it. The second day was the main event, the anniversary party. The sprawling gardens of the estate were filled with a sea of elegant dresses and dark suits. Laughter and classical music drifted on the warm afternoon air. Hannah felt like an imposter in a fairy tale, clinging to Theodore's arm as he navigated the crowd. She found herself cornered by Eleanor and two of her hawk-faced friends near a rose garden. The interrogation was subtle, but relentless. "And your family, dear?" one of the women asked, her eyes sharp and bird-like. "Are they in business? Or perhaps the arts?" "My father was a builder," Hannah said, her chin held high. "Oh, a builder," Eleanor repeated, exchanging a look with her friends that was as clear as a spoken insult. "How quaint." The condescension in her voice was a physical slap. Hannah felt her cheeks burn, the familiar sting of shame prickling her eyes. She saw him before he saw her. Theodore was across the lawn, deep in conversation with a senator.
But then his head lifted, his gaze scanning the crowd as if sensing her distress. His eyes found hers, and his smile instantly vanished. He saw the trio of women surrounding her, saw the forced tightness of her smile, the humiliation in her eyes. He excused himself from the senator with a curt nod. He moved through the crowd not like a host, but like a predator, purposeful, silent, deadly. The guests parted for him, sensing the shift in his demeanor.
He didn't stop until he was standing directly behind her. He slid his arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest in a gesture of blatant, unapologetic possession. The warmth of his body was a solid, protective wall at her back. "Excuse me, ladies," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr that cut through their polite chatter. His smile was charming, but his eyes were chips of ice. "But I need to steal my wife." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned her away from the stunned women and led her toward the center of the lawn, his hand firm on the small of her back. "Are you all right?" he murmured, his voice for her ears only. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice trembling slightly. "No, you're not," he said softly. They stopped in the middle of the garden, in full view of everyone. He turned to face her, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. The world seemed to melt away. There was only the green of the garden, the blue of his eyes, and the frantic beating of her own heart. "Don't ever let them make you feel small," he whispered, his gaze intense, burning with an emotion she couldn't dare to name. "You are the most magnificent person in this entire garden." And then, under the afternoon sun, in front of his mother, his family, and 100 members of high society, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a chaste, performative peck. It was a kiss of raw, unrestrained emotion. It was deep and consuming, a desperate claiming. It was a furious, passionate defense of her, a declaration to the entire world. His lips were firm and warm, moving against hers with a hunger that sent a shockwave through her entire body. She melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his suit jacket, her mind going completely blank. All thought was obliterated, replaced by pure, breathtaking sensation. This was not a lie. This was the truest thing she had ever felt. When he finally, slowly, pulled away, they were both breathless. His forehead rested against hers, his eyes still closed. The sounds of the party rushed back in, a distant, muffled hum. He opened his eyes, and the raw vulnerability in them stole her breath. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse, ragged. "I wasn't supposed to do that. I couldn't stop myself." She stared up at him, her lips still tingling, her entire world tilted on its axis. "I couldn't either," she confessed in a whisper. The game was over. The contract, the pretense, the carefully constructed walls, they had all just been burned to the ground by a single, devastatingly real kiss. The drive back to New York was a portrait of shared agony. The air inside the car, once charged with nervous tension, was now heavy with the suffocating weight of a truth neither of them knew how to handle. The kiss had been a point of no return. It had shattered the fragile framework of their agreement, leaving them adrift in a sea of unspoken, terrifying emotion. They sat inches apart, yet a vast, unbridgeable chasm seemed to separate them. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghost of his lips on hers, the memory of her hands clutching his jacket. He didn't drop her at her apartment. Instead, the car pulled up in front of her building, and a second, separate car was already waiting at the curb for him. A clear, clinical division. The game was over. They were no longer a couple. They were, once again, Theodore Vandenberg, the billionaire, and Hannah Scott, the waitress. "Hannah," he said, his voice strained, his gaze fixed on the window opposite her. He couldn't look at her. He stopped, swallowing hard. "The arrangement is concluded." Back in her small, quiet apartment, the scent of lavender and chamomile felt like a mockery. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a hollow, aching void. She walked through the familiar space, but it felt alien. The memory of him sitting on her sofa, of his deep laughter filling the room, was a collection of ghosts that haunted every corner. The game, the crazy, intoxicating game, was over. She was supposed to feel relieved, safe. Instead, she felt like she had been hollowed out. 2 days later, a notification pinged on her phone. It was an alert from her bank. A deposit had been made. She stared at the number on the screen, at the string of zeros that represented her freedom. It was the amount he had promised. The finality of it was a punch to the gut. The contract was officially, transactionally, complete. The money, which had once seemed like the solution to all her problems, now felt like severance pay, a payment for services rendered. It felt dirty. Instead of relief, a wave of devastating emptiness washed over her. The money meant nothing. It couldn't buy back the late-night conversations, the shared laughter in Paris, the protective warmth of his hand on her back. It couldn't buy the look in his eyes right before he kissed her. She knew she had to. She had to see him one last time, to close the circle. She took the subway to the Vandenberg Tower, a gleaming skyscraper that pierced the clouds. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like an ascent to a different planet. His office was larger than her entire apartment, with a glass wall that offered a godlike view of the city below. He was standing by the window when his assistant showed her in, his back to her. He turned, and his face was a mask of cool, professional indifference. The warm, laughing Theo from her apartment was gone. This was Mr. Vandenberg, the CEO. "Hannah," he said, his voice polite, distant. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I came to thank you," she said, her own voice sounding thin and strange to her ears. "For the bonus. It's very generous." "You fulfilled your end of the bargain," he replied, his tone clipped, businesslike. "It was a pleasure doing business with you, Miss Scott." Miss Scott. The name was a slap. The formality was a wall of ice erected between them. This was it then, the final scene. They were pretending again, but this time they were pretending they were strangers. "Right," she said, a bitter, hollow feeling spreading through her chest. "Well, thank you for everything." She turned to leave before he could see the tears welling in her eyes. Her hand was on the doorknob when she heard his voice, low and rough. "Hannah." She paused, her back still to him, her heart leaping with a sudden, foolish hope. "Yes?" she whispered. There was a long silence. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her back. "Good luck with your future endeavors," he said. The words were like knives. She didn't reply. She simply opened the door and walked out, the quiet, decisive click of the lock closing behind her. It was the sound of an ending, a door closing not just on an office, but on a world, on a possibility, on the most real thing she had ever felt. 2 weeks passed, 14 days, each one a carbon copy of the last, a long, hollow stretch of time that Hannah filled with work and exhaustion. The silence from Theodore was absolute. She threw herself into her shifts at the Gilded Spoon, the familiar rhythm of taking orders and carrying plates a welcome, mindless distraction. But the restaurant itself had become a torture chamber. Every corner held a memory of him. The corner table where he used to sit, the spot by the bar where he'd waited for her, the curve of the staircase he'd descended like a king on the day of the wedding. Her life was supposed to be better. The debt was gone. She was financially secure for the first time in her adult life. Yet, she had never felt more impoverished. The vibrant color he had brought into her world had faded, leaving everything in dull shades of gray. She missed his laugh. She missed the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he smiled. She missed the thrilling, terrifying feeling of being truly seen. Theodore, in his glass tower, was living his own private hell. The silence he had imposed was a self-inflicted wound. His vast, empty penthouse felt like a tomb. He would find himself walking towards the East Wing, towards her old room, before remembering she was gone. He'd pick up his phone to text her a funny observation, his thumb hovering over her name, before the cold reality crashed down on him again. He had built his life on logic and control, yet he had willingly, foolishly, let go of the one variable that made any of it feel worthwhile. He was drowning in the quiet, orderly world he had fought so hard to maintain. One Tuesday evening, as Hannah was balancing a tray of appetizers, a familiar voice cut through the restaurant's polite murmur. Hannah. She froze, her blood running cold. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Alexander. He stood there, looking just as handsome and confident as ever. He was alone. "I was hoping I'd find you here," he said, his smile a little too smooth. "What are you doing here, Alexander?" she asked, her tone flat. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "A huge mistake. Gloria and we're over. It was never real. Being with her made me realize that it's always been you, Hannah. I love you. Please give me another chance." His words, which once would have been everything she wanted to hear, now felt hollow. But they also represented something she desperately craved: familiarity, safety. An easy path away from the complicated, painful ache that Theodore had left in her heart. She felt lost and lonely, and Alexander was a harbor she knew well, even if it was a treacherous one. She saw the temptation for what it was, a step backward. But her heart was bruised, and the thought of something easy was seductive. I have to work, Alexander," she said, not giving him an answer. "Dinner, tomorrow night. Please," he pressed, reaching out and taking her hand. His touch was warm, but it sparked nothing inside her. "I'll think about it," she conceded, pulling her hand away. She didn't know that from a dark, secluded table in the far corner of the restaurant, Theodore was watching. He had come, as he had several times over the past 2 weeks, under the pathetic guise of inspecting the service, just to catch a glimpse of her. He needed to see her, even if it was from a distance, like a man dying of thirst, looking at a mirage. He watched the whole exchange. He saw Alexander's earnest, pleading face. He saw him take her hand, and most devastatingly, he saw the hesitation in Hannah's expression. He saw that she didn't immediately shut him down. He saw the flicker of consideration in her eyes. A cold, possessive jealousy, fierce and unfamiliar, seized him. It was a visceral, physical reaction, a punch of ice to the gut. He had no right. He had ended their agreement. He had pushed her away. But the thought of her going back to that man, of her laughter belonging to someone else, was unbearable. He realized, with a surge of cold, stark panic, that he hadn't just pushed her away. He had pushed her directly into the arms of the one man he couldn't stand to see her with. He was about to lose her, for good. The image of Alexander's hand on hers was burned into Theodore's mind. Jealousy was a foreign, venomous substance in his veins, and it drove him to act in ways that were completely illogical. The cool, detached CEO was gone, replaced by a man operating on pure, primal instinct. His silent pursuit began. He couldn't stay away. He started showing up at the Gilded Spoon almost every night, always taking the same dark corner table that offered a clear, unobstructed view of the main floor. He would order a whiskey, open a file on his tablet as a prop, and just watch her. He watched the way she moved through the tables with an effortless grace. He watched the way her face lit up when she spoke to Patricia, who often stopped by after her own shift. He watched her tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a simple gesture that made his chest ache with a longing so intense it was a physical pain. Hannah felt his presence like a change in the atmospheric pressure. She didn't have to see him to know he was there. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her as she worked, a silent, burning scrutiny that made the hairs on her arms stand up. It was unnerving. It was infuriating. He had made his choice, drawn the line between them with cold, hard cash. What right did he have to sit there now, haunting her like a ghost at the feast? Meanwhile, Alexander's campaign to win her back was relentless. Flowers would arrive at the restaurant daily, ostentatious bouquets that made her coworkers whisper. He would wait for her at the end of her shift, leaning against his car with a hopeful smile, offering to drive her home. She was adrift, caught in a miserable limbo. Her heart screamed for Theodore, for the man who had shown her a world of passion and connection she never knew existed. But that man had vanished, leaving only the cold Mr. Vandenberg in his place. Alexander, on the other hand, was present, persistent, and offering a simple, if flawed, future. The temptation to choose the tangible man over the ghost was growing stronger every day. One Thursday night, worn down by his persistence, she finally agreed to have a drink with Alexander after her shift. Just to talk, she told herself. From his corner table, Theodore watched her hang up her apron. He saw Alexander enter the restaurant and walk toward her, his smile triumphant. He watched as Hannah gave a small, resigned nod and reached for her coat. They were leaving. Together. Something inside him snapped. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with a swift, cold fury. He dialed the restaurant's general manager. "David, it's Vandenberg," he said, his voice low and clipped. "We have an emergency. A pipe has burst in the main wine cellar. I need every available staff member on hand to help with damage control. Immediately. That includes Miss Scott." He hung up before the bewildered manager could ask a question. It was a lie, a blatant, impulsive, reckless abuse of his power. He didn't care. Minutes later, just as Hannah and Alexander were about to walk out the door, David came rushing over, his face pale with panic. "Hannah, thank God. There's been a disaster in the cellar. Mr. Vandenberg just called. We need you." Hannah stopped, her brow furrowed in confusion. Alexander's face fell with irritation. "Can't it wait?" he asked. "Mr. Vandenberg said it was an emergency," David insisted. There was no arguing. With a frustrated sigh, Hannah apologized to Alexander and followed the manager toward the back of the house. As she passed Theodore's dark corner, she glanced over. He was staring down at his tablet, feigning ignorance, but the rigid set of his shoulders and the white-knuckled grip he had on his whiskey glass gave him away. She knew. In that instant, she knew with absolute certainty. It was him. He had fabricated the entire thing. Later that night, after the emergency had mysteriously resolved itself, she found him still there, the last patron in the empty restaurant. She marched to his table, her eyes blazing with a fire he hadn't seen since the Hamptons. "You," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and a strange, wild hope. "That was you." He looked up, his face an unreadable mask. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, Theodore," she shot back, her hands planted on her hips. "You invented that entire crisis to stop me from leaving with him. Why?" The question hung in the silent, cavernous room. He stared at her, the mask of indifference beginning to crack. His jaw was tight, a muscle twitching. "Why?" she demanded again, her voice rising. "You pushed me away. You ended it. If you don't want me, then for God's sake, just let me go." "Let you go?" The words exploded out of him, a raw, guttural sound that was nothing like his usual controlled tone. He shot to his feet, the chair scraping violently against the polished floor. The carefully constructed mask of the indifferent CEO didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, revealing the desperate, tormented man beneath. "I can't," he yelled, the sound echoing in the vast, empty dining room. He took a step toward her, then another, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Don't you understand, Hannah? I can't let you go." He was closing the distance between them, his powerful frame seeming to consume the space. The air grew thick, electric, vibrating with the force of his unleashed emotion. "I tried," he continued, his voice dropping, but losing none of its intensity. It was rough, ragged, torn from the depths of his soul. "God, I swear I tried. I tried to go back to being your boss. I tried to pretend that weekend never happened, that we never happened." He was standing directly in front of her now, so close she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. She could see the storm in his eyes, the raw pain, the frantic desperation. "But it's torture," he confessed, his voice breaking. "Every day is torture. I come here just to see you, just to watch you breathe. And then I see you with him. I see him smile at you. I see him touch your hand, and I feel like I'm being ripped apart, piece by piece." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a moment before his fingers brushed against her cheek. His touch was hesitant, reverent, as if he no longer believed he had the right. "I know our agreement is over," he said, his voice now a raw, pleading whisper. "I know I have no right. I know I'm the one who pushed you away. But that lie we built, that ridiculous, beautiful lie, it became the only real thing in my entire goddamn life." Tears she didn't even know were there began to well in her eyes, blurring his anguished face. "I'm in love with you, Hannah," he confessed, the words a final, desperate surrender. "I fell in love with my fake wife, and now I'm losing my mind without her." The confession hung between them, stark and stunning. It was everything she had secretly, hopelessly prayed to hear. Before she could find her voice, before she could even process the monumental shift that had just occurred, he acted. With a low groan that was part pain and part longing, his hands came up to frame her face, his fingers tangling in her hair. He pulled her to him, and his mouth crashed down on hers. This was not the calculated, possessive kiss from the garden. This was not a performance. This was an act of pure desperation. It was a kiss of starvation, of a man who had been deprived of air and was finally, greedily, taking his first breath. It was raw, hungry, and utterly consuming. It was the kiss of a man laying his entire soul bare, holding nothing back. He poured all of his frustration, all of his jealousy, all of his agonizing loneliness into it. And Hannah met him with equal force, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body melting against his. She answered his desperation with her own, her silent tears of heartache transforming into tears of overwhelming, cataclysmic relief. This was the truth, the real, unfiltered, catastrophic, beautiful truth. The kiss ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving them both breathless and trembling in the silent, cavernous restaurant. They stood forehead to forehead, the air crackling with the aftershock. Theodore's hands were still tangled in her hair, his thumbs stroking her temples in a gesture of pure, unconscious tenderness. "Theo," she whispered, her voice shaky. The single word held a universe of confusion, relief, and lingering hurt. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look into her eyes. The raw desperation was still there, but now it was mingled with a new emotion. Fear. The fear of a man who has just laid his heart completely bare and is terrified of having it crushed. The next day, the world felt both brand new and terrifyingly uncertain. His confession had changed everything, but it hadn't solved anything. It was a beginning, but a fragile one. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. It was Alexander. "Dinner tonight? I've made reservations at your favorite Italian place." "It's time we talked for real, Hannah. I love you. Let's try again." She stared at the message. A week ago, it might have tempted her. Now it was just noise, but it was also a catalyst. She knew what she had to do. She didn't text him back. Instead, she went to the Vandenberg Tower. This time, she didn't feel like an imposter. She walked into his office with a newfound sense of purpose, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. He was behind his desk, but he shot to his feet the moment she entered. He looked like he hadn't slept. His hair was slightly disheveled, and his eyes were full of a nervous, hopeful anxiety. "Hannah," he breathed. "I heard you," she said, her voice calm and even. She stopped in the middle of the room, keeping the vast expanse of his desk between them. "I heard everything you said last night." A wave of relief washed over his face. "Then you know." "I know you said you love me," she interrupted, her voice firm. "But words aren't enough, Theodore. Not anymore." His hopeful expression faltered, replaced by confusion. "You built a fantasy for me and it was beautiful," she continued, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "But then you hid from it. You used me in your game with your mother, and when it got too real you paid me off and discarded me like a business expense. You hurt me." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, his face paling. "If what you feel is real," she said, her gaze unwavering, "if last night wasn't just another moment of impulsive desperation, then you have to prove it. You have to show me." He looked utterly lost, a man stripped of all his usual power and control. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice raw. "I'll do anything. Just tell me." This was the moment. The power had shifted. He was offering her the world on his terms, but she needed him to understand hers. "That's the point," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I'm not going to tell you. I'm not another problem for you to solve with your money or your influence." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "You have 24 hours to figure it out, to show me that you see me, Hannah, not just a woman you want to possess." She started to walk toward the door. "And if you can't?" he asked, his voice strained. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, and looked back at him. The pain and fear in his eyes were immense, but she had to do this, for both of them. "Then I'm going to move on," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "For real this time." She walked out, leaving him alone in his silent, glass-walled kingdom with her ultimatum hanging in the air. The future of their story was now, entirely, in his hands. Theodore stood motionless in his office long after she had gone, the silence pressing in on him. 24 hours. The ultimatum was both a death sentence and a lifeline. For the first time in his life, he was faced with a problem that his usual arsenal, money, power, and logic, could not solve. He spent the night pacing the length of his penthouse, a caged tiger tormented by a single impossible question. How do you prove a feeling? His first instincts were all wrong, and he knew it. A diamond necklace? It would feel like another transaction. A trip around the world on his private jet. It would be another fantasy, another escape from reality. A public declaration? It would be about his ego, not about her. He sank onto the sofa, running his hands through his hair in frustration. He had to think. He had to see her. What did Hannah value? What did she dream of? His mind flashed back to their late-night conversations in her cozy, cluttered apartment. The memory was so vivid it was almost painful. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to listen not to his own voice, but to hers. He heard her talking about her fear of being trapped, her quiet pride in her independence. And then it hit him. A memory so clear it was like she was whispering it in his ear right now. "A small cafe and bookstore," she had said, her eyes shining with a distant, hopeful light. A cozy place that smelled of coffee and old paper, where people could feel at home. My own little world. Her own world, not his. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. He had been so focused on bringing her into his world, on making her a part of his story. He had never once thought about helping her build her own. He shot up from the sofa, his mind suddenly clear, buzzing with a new, terrifying, and absolutely correct purpose. He spent the next several hours on the phone, his voice a low, urgent command in the pre-dawn darkness. He called his personal lawyer, his real estate broker, his top architect. He was a man on a mission, wielding his immense power not as a hammer, but as a sculptor's tool. The next day, Hannah was a wreck. She went through her shift in a fog of anxiety. There had been no word from him. No calls, no texts. The 24 hours were almost up. The silence was his answer. He had failed. A cold, bitter disappointment settled in her chest. She had been a fool to hope. As she was leaving the restaurant, her shoulders slumped in defeat, a professional courier approached her. "Miss Hannah Scott?" "Yes?" "This is for you," the courier said, handing her a thick, heavy envelope before disappearing back into the evening rush. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside there were no flowers. There was no gushing letter of apology. There was a stack of official-looking documents. She pulled them out one by one, her confusion mounting. The first was the deed to a small commercial property in Greenwich Village, her favorite neighborhood, the one she'd told him she loved to walk through on her days off. The next were business licenses, all approved and paid for. The last was a set of architectural blueprints. Her eyes scanned the title block on the blueprints, and a choked sob escaped her lips. The project name was written in a simple, elegant font, Hannah's Place. It was a detailed plan for a cafe and bookstore. It was perfect. It was the exact layout she had described to him that rainy night, right down to the cozy reading nooks by the front window. Tucked inside the blueprints was a single, handwritten note on his personal stationery. His handwriting was sharp and decisive, just like him. It wasn't a love letter. It was something more. "Hannah, I don't want to give you my world. I want to help you build yours. And if you'll let me, I'd love to spend the rest of my life drinking coffee in it. By your side." Theo, tears streamed down her face, hot and fast. They weren't tears of sadness or relief. They were tears of being seen, truly, completely seen. He hadn't just listened to her, he had heard her. He hadn't tried to buy her or impress her. He had empowered her. It was the grandest, most romantic gesture of her life, and it had nothing to do with his money and everything to do with his heart. Hannah didn't walk. She ran. She hailed a taxi, her hands clutching the envelope as if it were the most precious object in the world. The documents were a testament, a tangible piece of his heart that he had laid at her feet. The city lights blurred past the window, a smear of color in her tear-filled vision. She burst into the lobby of the Vandenberg Tower, not bothering to check her reflection, and took the private elevator straight to the top. He was standing exactly where she had left him 24 hours before, by the massive glass wall, staring out at the city. He turned the moment the elevator doors chimed, his body rigid with tension. The look on his face was one of pure, agonizing suspense. He had played his final card, and had no idea if it had won or lost him the entire game. She strode into the office, stopping a few feet in front of him. She held up the envelope, her voice choked with emotion. "This is..." She couldn't find the words. "This is everything. It's yours," he said, his voice quiet, raw. "No matter what you choose, no strings, no contracts. It's a gift. Even if you choose him, I want you to have your dream." The selflessness of his words, the willingness to give her everything even if it meant losing her completely, was the final definitive proof. "There is no him," she said, her voice firm and clear, cutting through the last of his uncertainty. There was never really a him. She closed the remaining distance between them, stepping into his personal space, right up to the invisible wall he kept around himself. "But," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "there is one condition for me to accept this." A flicker of the old, powerful CEO returned to his eyes, a man ready to meet any demand. "Anything," he breathed. "I'll only accept," she said, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper, "if you agree to be my partner." He stared at her, confused. "Hannah, my business partner," she clarified, her smile widening into a grin. "I don't know the first thing about running a business. You do. I have the vision. You have the experience." She reached up and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. It was hammering against his ribs. "I want to build this with you, as my partner, in business and in life." The relief that washed over his face was staggering. It was like watching a man who had been holding his breath for his entire life finally exhale. A low, ragged sound escaped his lips, and then he was pulling her into his arms, crushing her against him. "Yes," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Anything." "Yes." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, and he kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperation or of passion, but one of profound, soul-deep relief. It was a kiss of homecoming, a kiss that sealed a new contract, one not written on paper, but on the shared landscape of their hearts. It was a promise of a future they would not just share, but build together, from the ground up. The months that followed were a whirlwind of joyful, chaotic creation. They were a team. Theodore, the man who managed a global empire, brought his formidable business acumen to the project, but he did so with a surprising humility. He never dictated, he advised. He secured the best contractors, negotiated with suppliers, and handled the labyrinthine world of permits and regulations, clearing a path for her vision to become a reality. Hannah, in turn, blossomed. Freed from financial worry and empowered by his belief in her, her creativity soared. She was the heart and soul of the project. She chose every detail, from the color of the walls, a warm, creamy white, to the specific blend of coffee beans. She spent weeks scouring flea markets and antique shops, finding the perfect worn-in armchairs and mismatched tables that would give the cafe its soul. They worked side by side, their days filled with blueprints and sawdust, their evenings spent poring over menus and book catalogs. They were partners in every sense of the word, their easy laughter and shared glances creating a language all their own. One afternoon, as they were unboxing a shipment of classic novels, Eleanor Vandenberg appeared at the doorway of the half-finished cafe. She looked entirely out of place in her designer suit and heels amidst the construction dust. "Theodore told me what you were doing," she said, her tone unreadable. She walked through the space, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Hannah braced herself for a cutting remark. Instead, Eleanor stopped by a window where Hannah had set up a small, sun-drenched reading nook. "This is lovely," she admitted, a note of genuine surprise in her voice. She turned to Hannah. "You have a good eye, child." Coming from Eleanor, it was the highest of compliments. From that day on, something shifted. The formidable matriarch had finally met Hannah on her own terms, in a world Hannah had built, and she had been, to her own astonishment, impressed. The grand opening of Hannah's place was a triumph. The cafe was packed, buzzing with warmth and happy chatter. The air smelled of freshly ground coffee, old books and new beginnings. Patricia was there, beaming with pride. Eleanor and Theodore's father were also there, holding court at a corner table, looking surprisingly at home. At one point, Hannah looked out the large front window and saw a familiar figure pass by on the street. It was Alexander. He glanced in, saw her standing in the heart of her own bustling, beautiful world, her face glowing with happiness. He saw Theodore walk up behind her and wrap his arms around her waist. A flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossed Alexander's face before he simply turned and walked on, a ghost from a past life that no longer had any power. Later in the evening, when the crowd was at its peak, Theodore tapped a spoon against a glass to get everyone's attention. He climbed onto the small, makeshift stage they had built for poetry readings. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his voice carrying over the suddenly quiet room. His eyes found Hannah's, and he smiled a smile that was just for her. "To the woman who taught me that the greatest business venture isn't about profit, and the greatest adventure isn't a game." His gaze was so full of love it made her heart ache. "She taught me that true wealth is finding that one person you want to share every single morning coffee with for the rest of your life." The room was completely silent. He stepped down from the stage, walked through the crowd, and stopped directly in front of her. Then, to the collective gasp of everyone in the room, Theodore Vandenberg got down on one knee. He pulled out a small, velvet box. It didn't contain a massive, ostentatious diamond. Inside was a simple, elegant ring with a single, perfect sapphire the exact color of his eyes. "Hannah Scott," he said, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze locked on hers. "You are the co-author of my life story. Will you marry me? For real this time?" "Yes!" The word burst from Hannah, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. She didn't whisper it. She shouted it, laughing through a fresh wave of happy tears. The entire cafe erupted in applause and cheers as she threw her arms around Theodore's neck, pulling him up from the floor and into a dizzying, triumphant kiss. Their wedding was not a grand affair in the Hamptons, or a society spectacle at the opulent plaza. It was perfect. They exchanged vows on a crisp autumn afternoon, right in the heart of the world they had built together. They stood under a simple arch of autumn leaves at the back of Hannah's place, surrounded by their closest friends, family, and the comforting scent of books and coffee. Hannah's mother, her face glowing with health and pride, wept openly in the front row. Beside her, Eleanor Vandenberg, in a surprisingly understated and elegant dress, patted her hand gently, a rare, genuine smile gracing her own lips. Later, after the ceremony, as the party was in full swing, Hannah pulled Theodore aside. "I have your wedding gift," she said, a mischievous glint in her eye. She handed him a beautifully framed document. It was a contract, written in her own elegant handwriting on a piece of thick, creamy stationery. He took it, his brow furrowed in confusion, and began to read it aloud. The Forever Agreement. Clause 1. To laugh loudly and often every single day. Clause 2. To never go to sleep angry, unless one is pretending to be asleep to win the argument. Clause 3. To always make time for morning coffee together, no matter how busy the empire or the cafe gets. He paused, a slow, wonderful smile spreading across his face as he read the final, most important clause. Clause 4. The party of the first part, Hannah, and the party of the second part, Theodore, hereby agree that Theodore will pretend to be Hannah's husband, devotedly and with extreme prejudice, for the rest of their lives. He looked up at her, his eyes shining. "This is the best contract I've ever seen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's binding," she replied softly. "For a lifetime." Later that night, long after the last guest had departed, they found themselves alone in the quiet, darkened cafe. The chairs were stacked, the lights were low, and the faint scent of spilled champagne hung in the air. Theodore put on a soft, slow song from a small speaker behind the counter and pulled her into his arms. They danced slowly in the middle of the room they had built, moving as one in the pale moonlight filtering through the large front window. "Who would have thought?" she whispered, her head resting contentedly on his chest, her cheek against the fine wool of his suit. "That begging a complete stranger to be my husband would lead me to the love of my life." He stopped dancing and tilted her chin up, his gaze soft and full of a love so deep it seemed bottomless. "I wasn't a stranger, Hannah," he murmured, his lips brushing against hers. "I was just waiting for you to find me." He kissed her then, a slow, sweet promise under the quiet gaze of 1,000 sleeping stories on the shelves around them. Their own story, which had begun with a desperate pretend plea, had finally found its truth. It was a story of partnership, of dreams, and of a love that was more real and more wonderful than any fantasy. It was their happily ever after, and it was only the first chapter.